the shadows in the walls. It started with a whisper, a faint, almost inaudible sound coming from the walls of Eleanor's apartment. She tried to ignore it, of course. There were always noises in an old building. The creaking floorboards, the rustling pipes, and the faint hum of the city outside. She'd only moved in a month ago, and everything was still new enough to be unsettling. At first, Eleanor convinced herself that it was just the house settling. But then the whispers became louder. Soft voices, barely perceptible, speaking in a language she didn't understand. It was as if something, or someone, was trapped inside the walls, begging for release. One evening, after another long day at work, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, when the whispering began again. This time, though, it was different. The voices seemed to be clearer, almost as if they were calling her name. Eleanor. She froze, the phone slipping from her hands onto the table with a soft thud. Her heart raced, and she strained her ears, but the voices faded as quickly as they came. The next night, the same thing happened. She heard her name again, clearer this time, followed by words that didn't make sense. Come closer. Terrified, Eleanor jumped from her chair, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whisper seemed to come from the wall behind her kitchen counter, the one where the pipes ran. She stood in the doorway, staring at it, her breath shallow. Come closer. The voice seemed almost inviting, but something about it felt wrong. Eleanor took a step back. It wasn't a voice of comfort. It was something darker, something that made her skin crawl. Over the next few days, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers would come at night, at odd hours, when she was in bed or in the bathroom. At times, they seemed to be right next to her, a chilling sensation crawling across her spine. After 2 weeks, Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. She decided to investigate. She gathered her courage, grabbed a flashlight, and approached the wall where the whispers seemed to originate. With trembling hands, she moved the small wooden cabinet from in front of the wall, exposing a section of peeling plaster. The whispers stopped. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She shone the flashlight across the wall. Nothing, just the worn, cracked plaster. But as she inspected the area more closely, she noticed something. Faint, almost invisible lines etched into the surface. At first, she thought they were just cracks in the wall, but then they began to take form. A pattern. A message? She leaned closer, her fingers brushing the edges of the lines. A cold shiver ran through her when she realized that the lines weren't cracks, they were words. They were written in the same strange language that the voices had spoken. Panic surged in her chest. She backed away quickly, feeling a surge of terror, her mind racing with thoughts of what these markings meant. The next morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The air in her apartment felt thick, oppressive. Every shadow seemed to twitch with movement. She had to leave. Eleanor decided to take action. She called a maintenance worker, hoping he could fix the strange noise in her walls. He arrived a few hours later, a middle-aged man with a tired face and worn hands. She led him to the kitchen, showing him the wall that had been the source of her torment. "Any chance you could take a look at this?" she asked, forcing herself to stay calm. He glanced at the wall, then at Eleanor, his eyes narrowing. "Not sure what you're expecting, ma'am. It's just a wall." She explained the whispers, the markings, everything. The man shook his head. "I don't know about any whispers, but I've worked in these buildings long enough to know they can get pretty strange. Old plumbing, old foundations, you name it. But let's take a look inside." He grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox and set to work. Eleanor watched, half expecting something to jump out at her. The man worked for nearly an hour, prying at the wall until it gave way. The darkness inside was thick, pressing against the light like something alive. And then, there it was. An old wooden box, nestled deep within the wall's cavity, covered in layers of dust and grime. The worker pulled it out, setting it gently on the floor. Eleanor took a step back, eyes wide. "Is that?" she began, but the worker was already lifting the lid. The sound of creaking would echoed in the apartment. Inside was a collection of strange objects, old, yellowed papers, a small stone, and something that made Eleanor's blood run cold. A faded photograph of a group of people, all staring directly at the camera with blank, hollow eyes. The worker hesitated, then carefully pulled out a small, tarnished key. "It's a relic," he muttered. "This is not something you want to mess with. You'd better leave it alone." But before he could close the box, Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing the photograph. In that instant, everything changed. A low hum filled the room, and the shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed to stretch and writhe. A voice, deep and guttural, filled her mind. "You shouldn't have touched it." The whisper wasn't from the walls this time. It was in her head. Eleanor screamed, stumbling backward, her hands clutching her ears in a futile attempt to block the voice out. The worker was gone, vanishing as if he'd never been there. The apartment had become a suffocating, dark place. The shadows that had once only seemed odd were now moving, shifting, and closing in on her. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an ancient, malevolent energy. The photograph in her hand burned her fingers, its black and white faces staring at her with hollow eyes, as if warning her of something far worse than the whispers. A cold breeze filled the room as the walls groaned and creaked, the floor shaking beneath her feet. And then, the voices returned, only this time, they were not whispers. They were screams. A cacophony of pain, of pleading, of anger. "You shouldn't have come." Eleanor turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. She was trapped. The shadows, no longer confined to the corners, began to reach out for her. And from the walls, a dark figure began to emerge. A twisted silhouette, its form shifting, ever-changing. Eleanor screamed, but the last thing she heard, before everything went silent, was the voice.
"Welcome home.